Howdy, Shasta College. How you doing? It's the last weekend of March of 2024. We'll never see the likes of that again. Hope you're doing well. Um, we have big plans for the Easter holiday, which is coming up. So I want to keep talking about movies. Get your papers in. Remember, it's due this Friday. I did that so you didn't have to have any homework over the week that you'll have off, which I believe is next week. Hope I have that right. Anyway, dig deep on the kid, look at it, try to enjoy it. Try not to be too judgmental that it's in black and white and silent. But the visuals are there. It's a very creative film. It's a film that put Charlie Chaplin on the map. And within a year or two, he was the most famous filmmaker in the world and the wealthiest. Um, but that's silent films. And I last time I talked to you about the 30s and 40s, a little bit about the 50s. So I'm going to start there today, the 1950s. We're still in black and white, folks, but now we have a lot of great sound movies and a new acting style called the method acting. People like Montgomery Clift and James Dean and Marlon Brando were doing a different sort of American male acting that hadn't been done before. Up until now, all the men in movies are being very rather stoic and um, heroic and stoic. Um, they rarely showed emotions besides anger or gunfight or something like that. These guys changed all of that. Brando had acted in a play, Streetcar Named Desire, on Broadway, and people were shocked and astounded about this new sort of masculinity that wasn't afraid to show their emotions, and so it made them even more uh, uh, appealing to the audience, women and men, by the way. And then they made that into a movie, great movie by Elie Kazan, and that sealed his fate even more of being this thing called method actor. James Dean had starred in East of Eden and Row Without a Cause, and he was bringing the same kind of quality. They're referred to as anti-heroes. They weren't your traditional John Wayne type hero, Clark Gable type hero. They almost were the antithesis of what we might think is heroic, but they were more real. Method acting has got a bad rap over the years. Essentially means they try to listen to what the other actor is saying to them, and they try to react in a very humanistic way with this thing called sense memory. So if you're sad, you're supposed to have a sense memory of something sad, of somebody dying, a pet, something. If you're angry, same thing. Try to put your real life in a memory. And so when you're saying the words, it's coming out more realistic and naturalistic, not so not so stoic and memorized like all acting was up until that point. Um, and we hadn't seen this before. Montgomery Clift was another practitioner. There's this sort of acting. Um, he was a very fragile actor, ended up dying way too early of alcoholism. James Dean died in a car crash at 24, way too early. And Marlon Brando lived until fat old, I think he was 83 or something when he died. So he lived a big life. Was in The Godfather, maybe seen that. Um, Later on, he had a lot of lawsuits. His son killed his sister's boyfriend, and then the sister committed suicide. There's a lot of tragedy in Marlon Brando's life. But for 10 years or so, maybe longer, starting with Streetcar Named Desire, Viva Zapata, The Wild One, and maybe his greatest acting anybody's ever done, On the Waterfront, another Elie Kazan movie, directed by Elie Kazan, and Brando won his Academy Award for that. He also won one later on for The Godfather. But by then, he didn't like our words. He didn't like the whole Hollywood system. He could have turned his back on it, except for when he needed the money. When he needed the money, he came crawling back. And he made some. His last great film, in my opinion, was Apocalypse Now, and then he did Superman, his father, and all this. He did that for money, folks. He was laughing all the way to the bank, and they were willing to pay his fee, whatever it was, because he needed money. Um, the other two actors I mentioned, Montgomery Clift died in the '60s of alcoholism. His career had gone right downhill because he had an auto accident that he had major facial reconstructive surgery, and he was never the kind of the same after that. And he became addicted to painkillers and liquor, and that took him right down. He was a closeted homosexual who can never live with that on his back. And so he started this brilliant career doing plays in New York, did some movies. Obviously, his most famous one is probably From Here to Eternity. Um, he did a lot of brilliant work. His first movie is called Red River, a Western with John Wayne, and he's wonderful in that. Sensitive, doing something that most men weren't doing, which is showing an emotional side to them that most male actors would not ever show. You never saw Clark Gable ever appearing weak. They felt it was a sign of weakness if they showed that. Gary Cooper, Clark Gable, same thing. Humphrey Bogart played a tough guy all his life. Was he tough? No. He was a spoiled rich kid who chain smoked himself to death at 57 years old. But he played tough guys because of his face, and mostly as a gangster. And so the 50s was a great upheaval. We're in a Cold War with Russia, but movies are being made and they're in competition with television. And they were losing. Most people by the mid 50s, definitely by the late 50s, had a television. Up until then, they were too expensive for most people to afford. But now you can get one at Montgomery Ward's or Sears out of the catalog, black and white, of course, and people are staying home. They stopped going to the movies because you could get free stuff at home. You had to sit through the commercials, but you're getting news programs, you're getting Milton Berle's show, you're getting I Love Lucy, some syndicated comedies like Father Knows Best, Donna Reed's show, and they're hugely popular. And movies started going downhill, just like when the COVID hit. They closed down all the theaters. It was took a huge hit, and how movies combated that. They came out with kind of one of a kind, tricky stuff like surround sound, Technicolor. There was one time they made movies. They're gonna smellorama the movie. If they're cooking on the screen, you can smell it in the theater. That didn't go over too good. Um, in LA, there's a Cinerama Dome, and they had huge screens that were in competition with because the small screen, most people have small TVs. And so they did a lot of Technicolor movies to try to combat the television, and they would do a lot of big, extravagant, sort of religious movies. The Ten Commandments, Ben Hur, a lot of them starred Charlton Heston. Um, and they were to get people out of their front rooms and back into the movie theater. It sort of worked. Um, and we came out, the 50s was a very conservative time. We had Eisenhower as president. He had been a general in World War II. We're in a Cold War, a lot of anti communism beliefs in this country. And there was a very dark point in our history that they actually had trials from the Senate. It was referred to as the House on Un-American Activities, and they suspected Hollywood was full of communists. Um, and so they would bring in Hollywood actors, directors, writers, and question them. And the question they asked was, have you ever been a communist? And if you have, do you know any fellow communists? Well, in the 30s in this country during the Depression, people had lost faith in the government, and a lot of them did turn to Marxism. It was before communism became what we know as it is today. It seemed like an ideal kind of nirvana type of existence. Nobody is above anybody else. Everybody's on equal level. Jobs pay everybody the same. Um, they didn't believe in private property. You could lease something, but you can't own private property. It wasn't until Stalin got in there in Russia where he corrupted Marxism into being the totalitarian, murderous government he did. He's known to have killed millions of his own citizens to keep who question his power, just like Putin's doing now. Um, to keep his power, he turned communism into the iron fist it is today. No freedoms, no freedom of speech, no freedom of moving around. Um, but in the 50s, we thought, a lot of people thought in this country, that communism was out to get democracy. And so there was this real fear, and they thought it was all coming from liberal Hollywood. And a lot of people lost their jobs over it because if you didn't name names, they would hold you in contempt and they wouldn't hire you. So a lot of writers, directors, actors never got hired again. Um, when Elia Kazan, the great director who directed On the Waterfront, came in, he named names. And a lot of people felt he sold out, but he had just started his career and he wanted to keep going. And but he said in his book, it's a great book, that he named names that other people had named. He didn't name any new names. Yeah, that's just kind of an excuse. But the people he named lost their jobs, mostly as writers. There's a great documentary. I'll have you guys look at it. I'll post it. Uh, the Hollywood 10, they were called. They're writers, screenplay writers. A couple of them had been nominated for Oscars, so they're highly regarded. And they were brought into the committee. And because they refused to name names, they were given contempt of court and they spent a year in prison. Yes, folks. Hollywood 10, Dalton Trumbull's one of them. Um, William Lardner was another one. Spent a year in prison. They were taken away from their families, their children. They couldn't make a living. It was ugly, ugly times. When we thought communism was going to infiltrate our democracy, it didn't work out, but we didn't know those days. So we're in the 50s in this dark time, very creative time. Some great movies came out in that era, great literature. This is when Jack Kerouac was writing John Steinbeck's best novels. Joseph Heller writing his Catch 22, Kurt Vonnegut. They all had healthy writing careers that were becoming healthy in the 50s and it went into the 60s and 70s. There's musicians, people, jazz was a huge thing. People like John Coltrane and Charlie Parker and Miles Davis, Dave Brubeck were playing what they called cool jazz, and it was popular with people. Now nobody hardly ever listens to jazz, but for a minute, from about 48 to 59 or there, it was jazz. If you ever listen to Miles Davis, kind of blue, you know what I'm talking about. In the meantime, rock and roll was starting. Elvis Presley came out in 55. Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard all started in the mid 50s. Starting, this music was called rhythm and blues, but then someone coined the phrase. His name was Alan Freed. He was a Dutch disc jockey in Cleveland. He actually created the phrase rock and roll. And the rest is history, folks. By the late 50s, rock was the main things the kids liked, the adults still were rebelling. They didn't like it, the look of it, the sound of it, I should say. And so music was popping, the art world was popping with with artists like Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning and Andy Warhol, and they were all so the 50s was a great hubbub. It's one of my favorite eras in this country. A lot of times when the country is kind of in a conservative grip, the artists are rebelling against that, and a lot of great art comes out of that. Um, when the 60s hit, things were different. We had a new president, John F. Kennedy, the youngest president we'd ever had at 48. He had this really pretty wife. He was a young man. He looked cool. He was a war hero from a very famous family that's made their money through bootleg liquor and other things, the Kennedys. His one brother was killed during the war. Uh, he was wounded and a war hero. They made a movie about his life called PT 109, which is meaning he was on a patrol boat that was sunk by Germans and they had to survive in this island. Cliff Robertson stars in the movie. So all of a sudden we have this young president, um, means it's a new era. They actually refer to this era as Camelot because it was from that song, the movie, the Broadway musical Camelot, about this great kingdom, this paradise type of kingdom. Of course, it's all fixed. It's a myth. There was no such thing. Um, but that music was popular. People wanted to feel good. We're tired of the Cold War. We're tired of black and white movies. We want to go back into the movie theaters, and Hollywood still is trying to figure out its way. They're missing out on one key element that they never did understand. That's the youth market. In the 60s, the kids that were born in the late 40s were teenagers now, and they weren't seeing any representation of their generation on the movie screen. A filmmaker by the name of Roger Corman, who's still alive, by the way, he's pushing 100, saw a niche there, and he started making movies for this teenage audience. He made um, gothic horror movies that were kind of tongue in cheek with Vincent Price, Jack Nicholson. Young Jack Nicholson is in a couple of them. He made his other partners made the Beach Party movies with Annette Filichino and Frankie Avalon, which is huge, huge hits. Uh, Corman made biker films with Hell's Angels. He made a dozen of those things, and they're all money makers. Kids wanted to see Rebels, and Roger Corman gave through his business acumen of marketing to the youth and drive-in movie theaters. At one time, have you ever been to a drive-in? At one time in the US, we had over 5,000 drive-ins. I grew up in the drive-ins. I loved them. Um, and he said the market for these young youth, because kids are going to these drive-ins, on dates and stuff, being naughty in the back seat. A lot of pregnancies were happening, but folks. Um, and he said, let's market these movies to the drive-ins. And they're hugely successful. Hollywood still didn't get the picture. 1963, Kennedy's assassinated. Camelot dies. We're in a nightmare world now of starting to have a lot of hate. But in the meantime, we're getting the civil rights going. Blacks are getting their civil rights. Women are starting to get more rights in the job place. Things were popping, plus a little thing called Vietnam was happening. And Hollywood still didn't understand that young kids under 25, want to see movies they can relate to. In the meantime, Hollywood's making these blockbusters like Hello Dolly and Darling and all this other stuff that nobody could relate to. The kids are going, well, we don't want to see these old fogey movies. Corman filled that gap with his movies and how smart he was. Um, Hollywood didn't get the picture for the longest time because that's how they are. They're not the best and the brightest. They're businessmen. And then a movie came along that was made for $300,000. It's going to be in the documentary I'm going to have you watch. It's called Easy Rider, and it made $100 million. People never seen anything like it. Had a rock and roll soundtrack. Never heard that before. Dennis Hopper, an actor, was directed it. Peter Fonda was the producer. He stars in it. Henry Fonda's son, if you know the Fondas, Jane Fonda's younger brother. And this movie changed everything. Didn't come out, it's filmed in 60, didn't come out until 69. And 69 was a bumper crop of life cinema changing films. Hollywood had to listen now because they were out of step with their own audience. And we had films like The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, the masterpiece Western by Sam Peckinpah, The Wild Bunch, and they had to pay attention. They saw a new world order, and kids were going to these movies over and over again. I was one of them. I must have seen Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, a dozen times. I've seen The Wild Bunch 100 times. We loved it so much. That's what prompted me to go study film. I was a youngster. I saw those movies and I said, I want to do that somehow. By the time I got to Hollywood, it was kind of definitely waning. By the time I got down there in the late 70s, the big deal was Star Wars and movies like that. And that's another story. So that's the 60s. And another thing that changed was the music and the youth market. 1964, a little band from England called the Beatles changed the face of our youth culture. They were on Ed Sullivan one night playing two songs. Every 12-year-old girl was screaming their heads off because they were so cute. And every 12-year-old boy said, I want to do that. The Beatles started a youth quake of the highest order. So now we got music is changing. It's starting to go in the youth market was working. Vietnam was haunting all the youth because there was a draft. We could get drafted and have to go fight in this war nobody believed in. Um, Lyndon Johnson was the president. He had by default because he took over after Kennedy was assassinated. Assassinations weren't over. Assassination of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Bobby Kennedy again shook us to our core. Things had changed. The hippies didn't work out. It was no longer peace and love. It was assassinations. And then on top of that, Charles Manson shows up in the 60s and murders a bunch of people. His hippies did. That didn't help. And then we had Ultimate concert. Rolling Stones put on a free concert. And one of the concert goers was beat to death by the Hells Angels. And the 60s came to a dark close. Opened up to the 70s. That's all I'm going to talk about today. I hope you guys have a good weekend. I'll be yakking at you soon. Enjoy your time off. Get your papers in. No late assignments. And if you are going to be late, you got to let me know. And you'll lose points for sure. Okay. Enjoy your paper. Enjoy the movie I signed you, The Kid. You should have it ready because it's going to be due tomorrow. Good luck with that. I'll see you next time. You know how to get a hold of me. If you need me, I'm here. I'm around. I'm here for you. Go see some cool movies. Stream a movie because everything is cinema.